June 16th, 1991. Denver, Colorado. An armed gunman commits a robbery from the underground vault at the United Bank Tower on Father's Day and makes off with $197,000 in cash. In the process, he fatally shoots 4 guards: 33-year-old William McCullom Jr., 41-year-old Phillip Mankoff, 21-year-old Scott McCarthy, and 21-year-old Todd Wilson. 2.5 weeks later, a 54-year-old retired police officer named James King, who once worked as a guard at the bank, is arrested and charged with the robbery and the murders. However, since the stolen money is never recovered, and no physical evidence links King to the crime, he is acquitted of all charges at trial, so the Father's Day Bank Massacre remains shrouded in mystery. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and this week we're going to be doing something unique by covering an unsolved bank robbery which also involved the murders of 4 victims: the Father's Day Bank Massacre. As you probably heard, The Trail Went Cold is going to be appearing on Podcast Row at the True Crime Podcast Festival this weekend in Denver, Colorado, and per tradition, whenever I travel to one of these events, I always like to release an episode about a cold case from the host city that very same week. And I can honestly say that our podcast has never covered a story quite like this one. As you might have guessed, the Father's Day Bank Massacre took place on Father's Day in 1991 at the United Bank Tower in downtown Denver and involved a lone gunman stealing $197,000 in cash from an underground vault. Tragically, 4 guards, William McCullom Jr., Phillip Mankoff, Scott McCarthy, and Todd Wilson, wound up being shot to death during the robbery, though, curiously, 6 employees who'd been counting cash in the vault at that time and came face to face with the robber were allowed to live. There was immediate suspicion that the perpetrator had inside knowledge of the building and may have been a current or former employee, and within 2.5 weeks, a suspect named James King would be arrested and charged for the 4 murders and the robbery. King was a 25-year veteran with the Denver Police Department who had worked as a guard at the United Bank Tower following his retirement, but the case against him was very circumstantial, and the murder weapon and the stolen money could not be found. In the end, the jury thought there was just too much reasonable doubt to convict King, as he was found not guilty on all charges. To this day, opinions are sharply divided about whether King was the right guy or not, but he was never conclusively linked to the crime, and no matter which way you look at it, someone got away with 4 murders. So on this episode, we're going to look at both sides of the case and analyze the evidence pointing towards King's guilt and innocence. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. As our Patreon page has over 70 exclusive bonus episodes and archives which are not available in our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the Father's Day Bank Massacre. Our story begins in Denver, Colorado in 1991 and takes place on June the 16th, which happens to be Father's Day that year. The scene of the crime is the United Bank Tower, a 52-story bank and office tower complex located on Lincoln Street in the downtown area, which has since been renamed the Wells Fargo Center. Since it was Sunday, the bank was closed for business, but a number of deposits were being made that morning from armored car deliveries, and a skeleton crew of employees were on the premises in order to count the money. At 10:55 a.m., an alert was sent out over the police band to announce that a robbery had taken place at the United Bank Tower, as a group of employees from the underground vault area in the basement had entered the building's main atrium to inform the guards on duty there about what happened. The employees included the senior vault manager, David Barranco, who was accompanied by tellers David Twist, Maria Christian, Chong Cho, and Kenitha Whistler. They all claimed that 1 hour earlier, they were processing cash deliveries when an unidentified man entered the vault area and pointed a gun at them before ordering them to cover their eyes and lie on the floor. While varied descriptions were provided by the witnesses, the consensus seemed to be that he was a white male in his late 40s or early 50s who was approximately 6'1" and weighed about 180 pounds. He was described as having salt and pepper colored hair, a mustache, and an adhesive strip on his left cheek. He was also dressed in a brown fedora, a gray sport coat, a white shirt, a multicolored necktie, blue or gray slacks, and was wearing mirrored sunglasses. After the employees lied down on the floor, the gunman ordered Barranco to fill a black satchel with cash from all the workstations. After the satchel was filled and the robbery took possession of it, he told the employees to crawl into a 5-foot by 6-foot room known as a man trap, an access control point located next to the vault, with 2 sets of doors that could only be opened by keycards. After the 5 employees were forced into this tight space, the gunman locked them inside before exiting the vault area. After remaining silent for around 20 minutes, the group noticed a broken metal spoon lying on the man trap's door sill, which may have been left there by someone who had lunch. The employees used the spoon in an attempt to pry the man trap doors open, and after another 20 minutes or so, they managed to free themselves and went upstairs to the atrium to seek help. Well, it turned out that during all this chaos, the robber had neglected to notice that a 6th employee named Nina McGinty had been working in the vault room, but the moment he entered, McGinty was able to hide behind a wastebasket under a counter. As a result, she was not spotted by him and managed to avoid being locked in the man trap with the others. After the robber left, McGinty made it to a phone and was able to call for help, but since she did not have a keycard, she was unable to leave the vault until police arrived. A search was performed of the United Bank Tower, and while no trace of the robber could be found, it wasn't long before the authorities discovered that 3 murders had taken place in the building's guard room, where the guards on duty were supposed to be watching over the facility on a series of monitors. The bodies of 41-year-old Phillip Mankoff and 21-year-old Scott McCarthy were found inside an adjacent battery room, as it was apparent that the robber had likely forced them in there at gunpoint, where they were told to get down on their knees before they were shot execution style. Mankoff had 3 gunshots to the back of the head, and since McCarthy's body was lying on top of his, and he had bullet wounds in his arm, wrist, and the front of his head, he likely attempted to put up a struggle against the assailant. While Mankoff had worked with United Bank for a few months, McCarthy was a trainee who happened to be on duty for the very first time. The body of a 3rd guard, 21-year-old Todd Wilson, was found in the middle of the guard room several feet from the battery room. Wilson was shot a total of 6 times, and the evidence seemed to indicate that he walked into the room right after Mankoff and McCarthy were killed and was ambushed by the gunman. This was only Wilson's 6th day on the job, and he was close friends with McCarthy, as he had been the best man at McCarthy's wedding the previous summer. At the outset, police believed that the prime suspect might be 33-year-old William McCullom Jr., the senior member of the security team who had been on duty that morning, as his whereabouts could not be accounted for. However, several hours later, at around 5:45 p.m., McCullum's body was discovered inside a storage room 1 level below in the building's sub-basement area. He had been shot a total of 6 times, 4 times in the head and 2 times in the back. While McCullum's shift ordinarily would have ended at 7 a.m. that morning, he had apparently agreed to stay later in order to help Mankoff train McCarthy on his first day on the job. In what turned out to be a source of major controversy, none of the 4 murdered guards were armed. While the guards had previously been allowed to carry guns on the job in the past, the Minnesota-based Norwest Corporation had recently acquired United Banks of Colorado Incorporated, and in April, 2 months before the robbery, they instituted a new policy requiring bank guards to be unarmed, as they felt that no guns would decrease the likelihood of violence. In total, it was believed that the unidentified robber fired 18 shots, as 17 bullets were found in the guards' bodies, while 1 bullet was found in the doorknob to the locked supervisor's office. Curiously, even though all 18 shots had been fired from the same .38 caliber weapon, it turned out that 5 different brands of bullets from 5 different manufacturers had been used. The assailant also went to the trouble of collecting all 18 shell casings from his shots and presumably took them with him when he fled the scene. In addition, he seized a number of items from the guard room, including 10 videotapes, 16 sets of keys, a 2-way radio, and pages from the guard logbook, so there was no available surveillance footage of the perpetrator. Shoe prints were also found on the window and door to a room where the bank had previously stored ammunition and guns for the guards, as well as the adjacent drywall, which seemed to indicate that the robber had made an unsuccessful attempt to break into the room by kicking his way inside. Well, even though the last sheet in the guard logbook was stolen, investigators were able to trace some impressions which were made under the missing page, and determined that the last entry, presumably written by Mankoff, stated that McCullom had been dispatched to let someone named Bardwell into the building. This was likely in reference to Robert Bardwell, one of the bank's vice presidents, but Bardwell was on vacation in the mountains with his family that day and had not been anywhere near the United Bank Tower. However, phone records showed that a call had been made to the guard room at 9:14 a.m. from a street-level security access phone next to the freight elevator in the parking garage, and this allowed investigators to piece together a scenario of how the robber entered the building. They theorized that he pretended to be Bardwell when he phoned the guard room and asked them to come up and meet him in the garage. When McCullom took the freight elevator there, he was likely accosted at gunpoint by the robber, who then forced McCullom to take him down to the sub-basement area 3 levels below. After the elevator arrived there, the gunman escorted McCullom to the storage room and shot him 6 times before leaving his body inside. He also took McCullom's access card, which allowed investigators to use electronic records to track his next movements. After killing McCullom, the robber navigated through a labyrinth of corridors and rooms before using a stairwell to walk up 1 floor to the basement area. He wound up setting off an alarm in the stairwell at 9:20, though it was theorized that this may have been done intentionally in order to lure Wilson out of the guard room to check it out. Electronic records showed that the assailant used McCullom's access card to enter the guard room at 9:24 while Wilson was gone, and he proceeded to shoot Mankoff and McCarthy. Wilson then used his own access card to return to the guard room 2 minutes later before he was fatally shot. At 9:48, the robber used McCullom's key card to access the vault area, and after detaining the employees there and loading up his satchel with the stolen money, he left at 9:56. A limited access elevator was found locked on the 7th level of the parking garage, an area that was reserved for bank officials, so the robber presumably used the key card to take the elevator there, though it was never determined how he exited the building or what he used as transportation to leave. In total, the perpetrator got away with $197,080 during the robbery, which would have been an estimated 18,000 bills of different denominations, but this surprised investigators since there was over $2 million in both the cash room and the vault, meaning that around 90% of the money that was available had been left behind. Since he took the lives of 4 people, the robber became the most wanted criminal in the state of Colorado, though the authorities could not understand why he elected to kill the unarmed guards, but allowed the 6 employees from the vault to live. Regardless, until the infamous Columbine High School massacre took place in 1999, this was considered to be the worst mass shooting in the history of Colorado. A massive investigation was launched, which involved over 24 detectives from the Denver Police Department and over 40 agents from the FBI. N. Bernie Hart, the chairman of the United Bank, announced that they were offering a $100,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the killer, and they would also establish a fund for the families of the murdered guards, depositing $50,000 into the account. Right from the outset, investigators suspected that the robber was a former or current employee at the United Bank Tower, as he seemed to have knowledge of the layout of the building and its security protocols. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, a number of these employees were interviewed and checked out, and only one of them could not be eliminated as a suspect. The individual in question was James William King, a 54-year-old former police sergeant who had retired from the Denver Police Department in 1986 after 25 years of service. While King received a $20,000 a year pension, he wound up declaring bankruptcy within a year of his retirement due to financial problems, and he had to move into a smaller home. At this particular point, King was residing in a suburban neighborhood in Golden, which was a part of the Denver metropolitan area. He lived with his 48-year-old wife Carol, whom he had been married to for 29 years, and they had 3 adult sons, James Jr., Greg, and David. It turned out that King had once held a part-time job working weekends as a guard at the United Bank Tower between July of 1989 and August of 1990. 1 week after the robbery, King was visited at his home by investigative reporter John Enslin of the Rocky Mountain News, who had dug up information about King's background after seeing his name on a list of former employees. By this point, King had not even been interviewed by anyone in law enforcement, but he agreed to speak with Enslin and openly expressed his shock at the robbery and discussed over the fact that the murdered guards had not been allowed to carry firearms. During his time working at the United Bank Tower, King claimed that he always carried a gun on duty, and while he said he had left the bank on good terms when he quit, he had complained that security at the building was lousy. King said it was common practice for employees there to misplace their keycards and call down to the guard room to ask to be let into the building, which likely explained how the robber was able to gain access by impersonating Robert Bardwell. Shortly after his interview with Enslin, King was interviewed by the FBI, who had their suspicions about him. Even though King had left his job at the United Bank Tower 10 months before the robbery took place, he had amassed substantial debt by this point, as he was behind on his house payments and had around $25,000 in credit card bills. During his time working at the bank, King often performed security runs, which would have allowed him to obtain vast knowledge of the building's layout, security system, and procedures. In fact, some of King's former co-workers recalled King wearing a mileage counter on his belt, though he said he only wore it for exercise purposes since he always had issues with cholesterol and wanted to time how long it took for him to walk from one part of the bank to the other. Investigators remained suspicious about King and gradually started building a case against him until David Twist, one of the employees from the vault area, positively identified him as the robber. On July the 3rd, King was arrested and taken into custody, and 4 of the other 5 employees who were in the vault that day also identified him as the perpetrator. King was then charged with a total of 15 felonies, including 8 counts of first-degree murder, which consisted of 4 counts of deliberate murder and 4 counts of murder during the commission of a felony. He was also charged with 6 counts of menacing for having threatened each of the 6 employees inside the vault, as well as 1 count of aggravated robbery. King was held without bond in the Denver County Jail, but after obtaining the services of noted criminal defense attorney Walter Garash, he would enter a plea of not guilty to all charges. All of King's family members, friends, and colleagues were left in complete shock by his arrest, as they described him as a kind, generous man with no known history of violence, who had not fired his gun once in the line of duty during his 25-year police career. His mother, Doris King, told the media, quote, "He'd do anything to avoid an argument. He would rather be diplomatic. He was the most nonviolent person you would want to meet. Almost too good to be true." End quote. It appeared that the case against King was very circumstantial, as a search of his residence failed to turn up any of the stolen money from the robbery or the murder weapon. It also did not turn up a fedora, mirrored sunglasses, or any clothing which matched the description of what the robber had been wearing. While there did not appear to be any physical evidence which linked King to the crime, some shoes were found in his house, which did seem to resemble the shoe prints found in the United Bank Tower guard room. Investigators also found a folder labeled Plans, which contained 4 detailed one-page maps of the United Bank Tower's interior, including the concourse level with the elevators and the vault. King's computer was confiscated, and his hard drive contained a copy of a book he had been working on titled The Police Officer's Guide, which had a section about bank security where King specifically commented on the weaknesses of the security at the United Bank Tower. In addition, while searching through a safety deposit box that King had, the authorities found 5 phony identification cards featuring King's photograph and a number of different aliases. However, before King's trial could start, a district court judge ruled that the phony IDs could not be used as evidence against him, since it was never established that they had any connection to the robbery or that King had used them to perform illegal activity. The trial would finally begin in Denver District Court on May 19, 1992, in front of a jury of 7 men and 5 women, and it was also broadcast live on court TV. By this point, the judge had dismissed the 6 menacing charges against King, so he was standing trial for 8 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of aggravated robbery. If King was found guilty, the prosecution, led by Denver Deputy District Attorney Bill Buckley, was planning to seek the death penalty. King was represented by defense attorney Walter Garish and co-counsel Scott Robinson, and they would attempt to tear apart the prosecution's case. The strongest evidence against King appeared to be the eyewitness testimony by the employees from the bank vault, as 3 of them positively identified King as the robber during a photo lineup. 2 of them said there was a strong similarity between King and the suspect, and only 1 of them failed to pick King out. However, the defense argued that there were a lot of issues with the identifications. All 6 employees were initially asked to look at a photo book of former guards from the United Bank Tower, but even though King's photograph was in there, they failed to pick him out. But when King shot to the top of the list of suspects, the authorities came up with the idea of drawing a hat, mustache, and sunglasses on the photos of all the individuals in the book, so they would have a closer resemblance to the robber. When one of the employees, David Twist, was asked to look at the altered photos, and he saw this new picture of King sporting a hat, mustache, and sunglasses, he positively identified him as the perpetrator, which paved the way to a warrant being sworn out for King's arrest. The initial plan was for the remaining 5 employees to do a live lineup to see if they could also identify King, but this idea was compromised when King's photograph was shared by the media before the lineup could take place. The authorities instead asked the employees to look at a photo lineup featuring an altered picture of King with a hat, mustache, and sunglasses, though unlike the previous photo lineup, this one featured mugshots rather than photos of former bank guards. All but 1 of the employees concluded that King was likely the robber, but the defense argued that cognitive bias played a role in their identifications, since King had already been arrested by that point, and the witnesses saw his photo in the media. The defense also argued that eyewitness identification based on altered photographs was not reliable. When David Twist took the witness stand to testify, the defense performed a demonstration by showcasing an altered photograph of a man disguised in a hat, sunglasses, and a mustache, and they asked Twist to identify him. Twist was unable to do so, and it turned out he had been looking at an altered photo of none other than actor Harrison Ford. The defense's argument was that if these witnesses failed to identify one of the most famous celebrities in the world while he was disguised in a hat, mustache, and sunglasses, how reliable was their identification of James King? Now, one detail which did make King look suspicious was that he previously had a mustache, but decided to shave it off 10 days after the robbery took place and almost immediately after his initial interview with the FBI. King's explanation was that he had developed sore pimples on his lip that were being irritated by his mustache, which is why he decided to shave it off. In another strange coincidence, King also claimed that he lost his driver's license during this time period, so he got it replaced shortly after he shaved. The replacement license wound up featuring a brand new photo of King without his mustache, and there did not appear to be any pimples visible on his lip. However, one detail which seemed to point away from King was the fact that he had a number of visible moles on his face, but none of the witnesses had reported seeing any moles on the robber and described him as having a clear complexion. Of course, they did say that the suspect had an adhesive strip over his left cheek, which could have been used to conceal some moles that King had there, but he also had additional moles above his right eyebrow and on the center of his forehead, which were never mentioned by the employees. The witnesses also did not describe the robber as wearing gloves, even though none of King's fingerprints were found anywhere at the scene, and he wouldn't have had time to wipe them off. In fact, a clear palm print was found on the door jamb to the battery room where Mankoff and McCarthy were shot, and it did not match King. There was also some doubt about whether the shoes seized from King's residence matched the shoe prints found at the murder scene, as they were made by a size 9 shoe, whereas King usually wore size 10 or 11 footwear. By the time the trial rolled around, FBI tests ultimately concluded that King's shoes did not match the shoe prints, though this did not preclude the idea that King wore a different set of shoes during the robbery that he subsequently disposed of. While the murder weapon was never found, it was established that King had carried a .38 caliber Colt Trooper during his time as a police officer, which was the same type of gun used in the crime. And after hanging on to the gun following his retirement, King used it as his duty weapon during his time working as a bank guard. By the time King was arrested, the Colt Trooper was no longer in his possession, as he claimed that he had dismantled the gun and disposed of it after discovering it had a cracked cylinder. One reason investigators suspected that the robber may have been a police officer is because a total of 18 shots were fired during the commission of the crime, and officers often contained firearms containing 18 rounds while on duty. As you might recall, when the bullets were recovered from the murder scene, it turned out that they consisted of at least 5 different brands from 5 different manufacturers. At the time, it was common practice for Denver police officers to deposit their spare rounds in bullet buckets at the respective police stations, as anyone could access these buckets if they needed some extra rounds to load their duty weapons. This meant that officers could potentially wind up loading many different brands of bullets inside their guns, so if King had used the bullet buckets during his time with the Denver PD, and then subsequently used his duty weapon to commit the robbery and the murders, this could have explained why all these different brands of bullets were recovered from the scene. Even though King had already previously owned a safety deposit box, it turned out that he paid a visit to his bank and decided to upgrade to a larger safety deposit box only one day after the robbery took place. King's explanation was that he accessed the deposit box that day in order to collect his son's birth certificate, but after opening the box and discovering how cluttered it was, he decided that he needed to get a larger one. The new safety deposit box had a capacity of 1,000 cubic inches, and an FBI agent would testify that the amount of money that was stolen from the vault measured 1,009 cubic inches. If accurate, this could have provided an explanation for why King only stole $197,000, even though there was around $2 million available in the vault. However, when the deposit box was searched, none of the stolen money was in there, though it did contain some other items, including the aforementioned phony IDs and some floppy disks storing backups of the book that King was working on. The defense argued that this theory about King stealing just enough money to fit inside his new safety deposit box did not account for the fact that King was already storing other items there at that time. The prosecution argued that King had a very shaky alibi on the morning the robbery took place, as he claimed that he drove into downtown Denver to visit the Capitol Hill Community Center to participate in a chess match with the Denver Chess Club. But it turned out that the chess club had not held meetings at the community center in 3 years, but King maintained he did not know this. While King had an interest in chess and had spent the past few years playing correspondence chess through the mail, he claimed he had not played any face-to-face chess with any opponents in quite some time, so he decided he was going to take up the hobby again as a Father's Day gift to himself. After spending the first part of the morning doing some yard work, King said that he left his home at around 9:15 a.m. and drove to the Capitol Hill Community Center, but after searching around for a while, he could not find any sign that the Denver Chess Club was still there, so he decided to head back home and arrived at around 10 a.m. Since the community center was located only about a mile and a half from the United Bank Tower, the prosecution believed that King had fabricated this alibi in case any eyewitnesses saw him in the downtown area that morning. No employees at the community center recalled seeing or speaking with King during this time period, though King said he did approach and asked an unidentified, well-dressed man if the chess club was still there. The defense attempted to support King's alibi by presenting testimony from two of his neighbors. One of them was Roberta Jo Trujillo, who claimed that she saw King mowing his lawn at around 9 a.m. and said to him, quote, "Happy Father's Day, you old fart." Since King's residence was located 11.5 miles from the United Bank Tower, and the robber first arrived there at 9:14 a.m., the defense argued that King wouldn't have been able to make it on time, though Trujillo acknowledged that she could have been mistaken about the time. However, another neighbor named David Lee Bell testified that they recalled seeing King drive up to his house at 10 a.m. and climb out of his car while wearing a pair of shorts. If accurate, Bell's account seemed to support King's story and placed him at another location at a time when the robber was still inside the bank. King's wife Carol also testified that shortly after he returned home, they both went to Mount Olivet Cemetery to visit the graves of some of her relatives, and she did not notice anything unusual about her husband at all. Robert Bardwell, the vice president whose name had been used by the robber to access the building, testified that nearly 1 year earlier, he noticed that he had lost his bank access card and reported it missing. The prosecution would allege that Bardwell noticed his card was missing on August 13, 1990, which happened to be only 1 day after King quit his job at the United Bank Tower. They also implied that since King's duties would have required him to perform routine patrols near Bardwell's office, this could have given him the opportunity to steal the card. But when Bardwell was cross-examined by the defense, he acknowledged that he could not remember the exact date when he reported the card missing, and had no recollection of ever meeting King when he was employed there. In fact, since King exclusively worked on weekends, and Bardwell said he had not worked on any weekends since early 1989, which was before King was hired, it seemed plausible that they may never have crossed paths at all. One of the most important witnesses for the defense was James Prado, the former head of security at the United Bank Tower. Prado seemed to downplay the significance of the maps of the building which were found inside King's home, as he claimed that every guard who was hired was issued a copy of these maps, and they were not required to return them if they quit. Prado also confirmed that the man trap where the robber locked up the employees had not been installed in the vault area until after King quit his job there in August of 1990. Prado expressed his belief that the robber was a former guard who would have needed to have some familiarity with the man trap, because otherwise he may have had trouble figuring out how to operate it and could have even accidentally locked himself inside. The defense put a lot of focus on a mysterious heat sensor alarm which went off at the United Bank Tower at 5:04 a.m. on the morning of June the 16th, 4 hours before the robbery took place. The alarm was located inside a tunnel in the sub-basement, which was ordinarily used to store records, and was likely activated when someone passed through there. At the time, either William McCullom or Phillip Mankoff would have been manning the control center in the guardroom, but since pages from the logbook were stolen, it's unclear if they ever filed a report about the alarm or took any action. But oddly, the alarm was reset at 9:33 a.m., which would have been the time period between when the robber killed the guards and entered the vault area. James Prado testified that on the morning of the robbery, he found a plastic coffee cup, a partially crushed 7-Up can, and cigarette butts in the tunnel where the alarm went off, though he did not realize their potential significance at the time. These items were eventually tested for fingerprints and came up empty, and while the cigarette butts later went missing, James King was not a smoker. While it was never conclusively determined if the items had any connection to the case, the defense pushed forward the possibility that the robber or a possible accomplice may have actually been inside the building as early as 5:04 a.m., which is why the alarm went off at that particular time. It also turned out that around 12:30 p.m. on Father's Day, hours after the robbery took place, a couple of employees from a rental car outlet at Stapleton International Airport reported dealing with a suspicious-looking man carrying a black satchel. He wanted to rent a car using cash, but the employees refused to do so unless he provided a credit card. The lead was pretty much set aside when King was arrested, but the description the employees provided seemed to match the description of the robber, and when shown King's photograph, they said that the man they dealt with was definitely not him. King's defense team had their sights set on a couple of alternate suspects, including Dewey Calvin Baker, a career bank robber serving time at the Santa Clara County Jail in San Jose, California. Throughout the trial, Baker sent a series of letters to King's attorneys in which he confessed to being responsible for the Father's Day bank massacre. On May 2, 1991, just 6 weeks before the massacre, Baker was paroled after serving time in prison for bank robbery, but wound up getting rearrested in the fall after committing a series of additional robberies. At the time he was paroled, Baker sported a distinctive mustache, though it was shaved off by the time he was rearrested months later. Baker also had a large mole on his left cheek and the same approximate spot where the robber had worn an adhesive strip. Even though Baker resided in California, phone records showed that he paid a visit to Denver sometime in May of 1991, though his actual whereabouts on June the 16th could not be established. The FBI claimed they had already investigated Baker and eliminated him as a suspect, and during his final letter to King's defense team, Baker recanted his original confession. During jury deliberations, the defense felt that a mistrial should be declared so they could further investigate Baker's claims, but the trial judge denied this motion as he did not find Baker to be credible and dismissed his letters as nothing more than quote-unquote jailhouse chatter. However, a more compelling alternate suspect in the robbery was Paul Yoakum, who had worked as a guard at the United Bank Tower between August of 1985 and August of 1990 and lived less than a mile away from the building. On Saturday, May 26, 1990, which happened to be Memorial Day weekend, the United Bank Tower experienced another robbery when $29,600 in cash was stolen from a secured room behind their automated teller machines. The perpetrator had turned off the lights to avoid being captured by the security cameras, and since Yoakum had been the last guard inside the room before the theft, and witnesses recalled seeing a man matching his description flee the scene, Yoakum became the prime suspect. When questioned, Yoakum initially said that he was innocent before he made a partial confession to the crime, but then recanted his statement and started maintaining his innocence again. Regardless, Yoakum was charged with the robbery, but none of the stolen money was recovered, and there wasn't much in the way of evidence that implicated him. As a result, when he went on trial in August of that year, the jury only had to deliberate for 90 minutes before they found him not guilty. Yoakum continued to maintain that he had been falsely accused and was so outraged by the whole situation that he quit his job with United Bank 2 days after his acquittal. Since Yoakum bore a bit of a resemblance to the suspect from the Father's Day bank massacre, he would be investigated as a suspect in that crime. When FBI agents performed a search of Yoakum's apartment, they found a closet door which had been secured with handcuffs, and it contained boxes of .38 caliber and .357 caliber ammunition, as well as a police scanner, speed loaders, batons, dummy grenades, and a bunch of replica police badges. Yoakum also wore a pair of boots, which seemed to have a sole pattern comparable to the shoe prints found at the crime scene, and he did not have a solid alibi during the time period the robbery took place. However, none of the projectiles from the ammunition in Yoakum's closet matched the projectiles on the bullets from the murders, and when the vault employees were shown a photo lineup featuring Yoakum's picture, they failed to pick him out. Since no real evidence linked Yoakum to the robbery, investigators pretty much dismissed him as a suspect, though ironically enough, when they asked him whom he believed might be a solid suspect in the crime, he mentioned James King. Surprisingly, King was willing to take the stand and testify in his own defense at the trial, and continued to deny any involvement in the crime. The trial lasted a total of 3 weeks before it went to the jury, and they wound up deliberating for a total of 53 hours over the course of 9 days before they reached a verdict. On June the 17th, the jury announced that they had found King not guilty on all charges, and he was officially acquitted. The jury's foreperson told the press that deliberations were extremely difficult, and they ultimately reached this verdict because they felt the prosecution had failed to prove King's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. When asked about their general consensus on King's guilt or innocence, she replied, quote, "None of us were 100% certain either way." Even though double jeopardy prevented the authorities from charging King with the same crimes again, the FBI would spend the next few years shadowing him in hopes that they might find some new federal charges they could file against him. However, King went on to live what was described as a quote-unquote hermit's existence at his residence in Golden, where he spent most of his spare time constructing elaborate sets with model trains. He did nothing to raise suspicion, such as spending large amounts of money, and since no trace of the missing $197,000 from the robbery ever turned up, the FBI eventually abandoned their investigation into King. Since many people in law enforcement remained convinced that King was the perpetrator, they did not spend much energy looking at alternate suspects, and in October of 1992, just 4 months after the conclusion of King's trial, Paul Yoakum succumbed to a fatal heart attack at the age of 52. As for James King, his wife Carol continued to remain with him until she died in 2009. King started to suffer from dementia, so he was placed in hospice care before he passed away on May 21, 2013, at the age of 77. Following his death, John Wilson, the father of slain bank guard Todd Wilson, told the press, quote, "Good riddance as far as I'm concerned. I still do believe King was guilty. There were too many facts," end quote. Indeed, opinions about James King's guilt and innocence continue to remain sharply divided, and after 3 decades, there's still no conclusive answers about who is actually responsible for the Father's Day bank massacre. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I didn't even realize until recently that I had never actually done a Trail Went Cold episode about an unsolved bank robbery before. While there are many other examples of robberies where the perpetrator was never identified and the stolen money was never recovered, there's obviously a major difference between an unsolved robbery where nobody was harmed and one in which 4 people were murdered. We still don't know what happened to the missing $197,000 from the Father's Day bank massacre, but that's of secondary importance to the fact that Phillip Mankoff, William McCullom Jr., Scott McCarthy, and Todd Wilson all lost their lives and never received justice. Now, I have covered other cases on this podcast about unsolved robberies in which multiple victims were murdered, such as the Las Cruces bowling alley massacre and the Lane Bryant shooting, though these particular crimes were so unusual that there's always been speculation that robbery may not have been the primary motive. But what's particularly odd about this case is that even though 4 bank guards were murdered, 6 bank employees were allowed to live, even though they all got a good look at the perpetrator. I mentioned earlier that in the months prior to the robbery, United Banks of Colorado Incorporated was acquired by the Norwest Corporation, and in 1998, Norwest merged with Wells Fargo, which is why the United Bank Tower is currently known as the Wells Fargo Center. Norwest received a lot of criticism over implementing a new policy that required all of their bank guards to be unarmed, as it's possible that things might have turned out differently if 1 or more of the 4 murdered guards had been carrying a gun that day. You can make your own conclusions on how this policy may have impacted the perpetrator's actions. On the one hand, if he knew ahead of time that the guards would be unarmed, that may have influenced his decision to commit this robbery. But on the other hand, if he was not aware of this policy and mistakenly assumed that the guards were carrying firearms, that could explain why they were shot while the vault employees were left alive. Whatever his motives were, I assume that the vast majority of bank robbers would prefer not to kill anyone at all if they don't have to, because there's going to be a lot more heat from the authorities if there's a murder investigation. Regardless of whether or not James King did this, it's always been suspected that the perpetrator was a former guard with inside knowledge of the United Bank Tower. So if 1 or more of these guards had worked with him in the past and recognized him, that could have influenced his decision to kill them. But it's worth noting that this may not apply to King because, as far as anyone can tell, he did not know or work with any of the 4 victims. So what are we to make of James King? Well, this is one case where I had zero prior knowledge before I started researching it, and after reading the summary on the Wikipedia page, I was inclined to lean towards King being guilty, as it seemed like there were a few too many coincidences pointing towards King for him to be innocent. But then I read more about King's background and learned that everyone described him as a mild-mannered guy with no known history of violence who did not fire his gun once during his 25 years as a police officer. In fact, if there was one complaint that King's fellow officers had about him, it's that he did not seem to have a forceful or aggressive enough personality to work a job like that. Usually, when a police officer or former police officer is accused of committing a crime, you can find a number of red flags in their background and incidents of them exhibiting questionable behavior on the job. But that doesn't seem to be the case with King, who did not fit the profile of someone who you would expect to single-handedly rob a bank and murder 4 people. In 1997, King's defense attorney, Walter Garash, and author Phil Goodstein worked together to publish a book about the case titled Murders in the Bank Vault, The Father's Day Massacre, and the Trial of James King. Garash might be the most famous criminal defense attorney in the history of Denver, as he had a long and storied career working on a number of high-profile cases just like this one, before he passed away in May of last year at the age of 96. The book does make a very compelling case for King's innocence and explains away some of the suspicious-looking coincidences which implicated King, though of course, you have to add the disclaimer that it was written by his defense attorney, so it may have a bit of a biased slant. But I will say that regardless of whether you believe King was innocent or guilty, the jury made the absolute right choice when they acquitted him, as I do believe there was plenty of reasonable doubt. This was obviously not an easy decision, as it took 53 hours of deliberation over the course of 9 days for them to reach a verdict, so they definitely did not come to this conclusion lightly. It sounds like when deliberations began and they took a preliminary vote, 8 jurors initially said not guilty, 2 said guilty, and the other 2 were undecided. They gradually worked their way to a unanimous not guilty verdict, and while some of the jurors remained unconvinced that King was innocent, they still felt the prosecution did not prove its case, so the only decision was to acquit him. If you read Murders in the Vault, you'll see that Walter Garash does not hold back on expressing his opinion on how the authorities were under such pressure to solve this case as quickly as possible that they became desperate enough to pin the crime on anyone. And once King popped up on the radar as a compelling suspect, they did not perform their due diligence when building a case against him and jumped the gun when they filed charges. One of the biggest sticking points for everyone is that the missing $197,000 was never recovered, so if King was guilty, it does not appear that he got the opportunity to spend that money since he continued living a modest, reclusive lifestyle in the same house in the years following the trial. Granted, the FBI was closely watching over King and were hoping to see if they could prosecute him on additional federal charges in which double jeopardy would not apply, so I can understand King wanting to keep his nose clean and not call attention to himself by suddenly spending large amounts of money. One aspect of the case which investigators always found puzzling is that the robber only took $197,080, even though there was around $2 million available in the vault area. This may have been done out of necessity, because if the robber was working alone, it's possible this was all the money they could fit into their satchel and carry out of the building. After all, it's not like he could just walk out the front door, as he needed to navigate through a number of levels, corridors, and rooms before he made his escape. At King's trial, the prosecution tried to infer that he stole just enough money to fit into his safety deposit box, an idea which seems pretty absurd, since King did not even rent a larger deposit box until the following day, and I'm not sure how he could have known ahead of time how much space the box would have. Whatever the case, none of the stolen money was found in King's deposit box, and a total of 18,000 bills were stolen that day, which is a pretty large amount. So if King did take the money, what did he do with it? King suffered from dementia during the last years of his life, so on the off chance that he hid the money somewhere, he very well could have forgotten the location before he passed away. When King was originally charged, this might have seemed like a cut-and-dried case for some people, since 5 out of the 6 surviving witnesses identified him as the robber. These days, many of us know that eyewitness identification in criminal cases can be notoriously unreliable and has played a role in a number of wrongful convictions. Back in 1991, I think a lot more stock was put into eyewitness identification, though King's defense team did a masterful job at pointing out serious flaws in the process which led to him being identified. As you recall, the first time the employees were asked to look at a photo lineup, none of them picked out King, and identifications only started getting made after they looked at a doctored photo of King with a hat, mustache, and sunglasses. The only employee who identified King prior to his arrest was David Twist, and the other identifications were made after King's photo was circulated by the media, which may have caused some cognitive bias. I will admit that I was initially troubled by the fact that King just happened to shave his mustache a few weeks after the robbery took place and almost immediately after he was interviewed by the FBI and learned that he was on the radar as a potential suspect. Getting rid of the mustache because it was aggravating some pimples on his lip seemed like a convenient excuse, and King also happened to lose his driver's license and get a new photo taken of himself while he was clean-shaven during this time period. This photo did not appear to feature any pimples on King's lip, though to be fair, pimples are only temporary and they could have easily gone away before the picture was taken. The main reason I might downplay this whole mustache angle is that during their initial statements, some of the vault employees apparently seemed inclined to believe that the robber was wearing a fake mustache as part of a disguise, and one of them even felt that it looked like it was about to start peeling off. So if their instinct was correct, there would obviously be no reason for King to be wearing a fake mustache if he was sporting a real one at the time. There's also been debate over the significance of King's moles, as the witnesses described the robber as wearing an adhesive strip over his left cheek on a spot where King had moles. If those had been the only moles on King's face, that might seem like too much of a coincidence, but he had some other moles in spots which wouldn't have been covered up, and the witnesses did not report having seen them. But if King felt the need to cover up one set of moles on his face with an adhesive strip, why not cover up the others? Now, if you look at photographs of King from this time period, the moles aren't instantly noticeable, and you have to stare at his face for a few seconds before you even realize they're there. So if King was the robber, it's possible that the reason the witnesses never mentioned the moles near his forehead is because they just didn't look at his face long enough to notice them. Not to mention that they would have been under a great deal of stress at the time and may not have been focusing too much on little details like that. If anything, putting an adhesive strip on your face only draws more attention to the fact that you're hiding something. And I suppose the big question is, if King was concerned about concealing his appearance, why not just cover up his entire face by wearing a mask? It would be one thing if this robbery occurred in a public place where a masked man might draw a lot of attention, but this was an underground basement area, and once again, it's so odd that this guy would kill one set of witnesses and then leave another set of witnesses alive who could identify him. The eyewitness identification appeared to be the strongest evidence against King, as no physical evidence linked him to the crime, and it seemed like the prosecution was basing a good chunk of their case against him on pure speculation. For instance, they assumed that since King claimed that he had disposed of his police-issued .38 caliber Colt Trooper following his retirement, this gun must have been the murder weapon, even though this was not conclusively proven. It was theorized that the reason 5 different brands of bullets were fired at the murder scene was because King had loaded his gun by picking out rounds from a bullet bucket at his former police station, but once again, this was never conclusively proven. Not to mention that King had been retired from the Denver PD for 5 years at that point, and was known for not firing his gun in the line of duty, so would he have even needed to access a bullet bucket? Since the robber had used the name of Bank Vice President Robert Bardwell to gain access to the facility, and Bardwell supposedly lost his access card only one day after King quit his job as a guard, the prosecution concluded that King must have stolen it. But this was nearly 1 full year before the robbery, and I'm sure Bardwell's access card would have been deactivated after he reported it missing. The whole point is moot anyway, since the robber used William McCullom's access card to move around the facility, not Bardwell's. Now, King admittedly did have a shaky alibi on the morning of the robbery, as it does seem like another odd coincidence that he would decide to pay a visit to a chess club which he had not frequented in years and no longer even existed, and just happened to be located about a mile away from the United Bank Tower. By placing himself at another location in downtown Denver, King would have had a ready-made explanation in case any witnesses just happened to see him that morning. However, while he did not have any witnesses to support his alibi, two of his neighbors did report seeing him outside his home at around 9 and 10 a.m. Granted, they both could be mistaken about the times, but Trujillo specifically remembered saying, quote, "Happy Father's Day, you old fart," while King was in his yard at 9 a.m., and she probably would not have said something like that to him unless it was actually Father's Day. We know that the robber used the security access phone to call the guard room at 9:14, and King's house was located 11.5 miles away from the United Bank Tower. Police claim that they timed the drive and determined that it was possible for King to travel from his home to the bank in 14 minutes, but I do think that sounds like a major stretch. Even if the police were able to make that drive, there's no way they could accurately recreate the exact same circumstances of that particular morning, as you have to factor in such things as traffic and stoplights. The testimony from David Lee Bell was more problematic to the prosecution's case, as he recalled seeing King pull up outside his home at around 10 a.m., which is the same time King claimed he returned home from the Capitol Hill Community Center. Electronic records showed that the robber used McCullom's access card to exit the vault area at 9:56, so obviously, if Bell was not mistaken about the date or the time, then his account would conclusively prove that King could not have committed the crime. Throughout this whole ordeal, King's wife Carol completely stood by him, and she was able to account for her husband's whereabouts for pretty much the rest of the day. If you don't believe Carol is lying and covering for him, then this means that after committing an elaborate robbery and murdering 4 people, King then traveled to a cemetery with his wife and visited his in-laws' graves without giving off any warning signs or red flags, which would make him quite the stone-cold psychopath if he was guilty. Now, ironically, the one piece of evidence which bothers me and has never been satisfactorily explained wound up being suppressed at King's trial, and that's the presence of 5 phony identification cards in King's safety deposit box, which featured his photo under a number of different aliases. This was not allowed to be introduced as evidence, since it was never established that King ever used these phony IDs or that they were connected to the robbery, so the defense never had to push forward an explanation for why King had them, and Walter Garash never really addresses this in Murders in the Bank Vault. I know King had worked in the Identification Bureau during his time with the Denver PD, so maybe he decided to put together these fake IDs as a hobby, or this was done as research on the book he was working on, but it's still very odd that he would have them in the first place. If King was the perpetrator, perhaps the IDs were his backup plan if he felt the authorities were closing in on him and he needed to flee the country. One thing which could support King's innocence was the fact that he was willing to be interviewed by investigative reporter John Enslin, who took the initiative to dig up King's name from the list of former United Bank employees and paid him a visit at his home. It sounds like King was nothing but cordial and cooperative with Enslin, but I have to think that if King was guilty and a reporter suddenly showed up on his doorstep to ask him some questions, he would be a lot more reluctant to talk to him. It's undeniable that King was not the most financially responsible person in the world and was in heavy debt at the time of the robbery, which could have given him a potential motive, but it's not like this debt was suddenly paid off right after the money was stolen. If King was desperate, I could see him brainstorming an idea to orchestrate a heist from his former workplace, since he would have been familiar with the building's layout and security procedures, but he had not worked there for 10 months and had no way of knowing if the layout and the procedures may have changed. As an example, the man-trap where the robber locked up the employees was not installed in the vault area until after King left, so there was some question about whether he would have known how to use it or even knew what it was. This detail could point to the perpetrator being someone who had been in the vault area shortly before the robbery took place or was being fed information by someone on the inside. One thing which the prosecution tried to push forward as an indicator that King was guilty is that while he was employed with United Bank, he allegedly had discussions with coworkers about what would be the best way to rob the place. But according to others who worked there, it was pretty much standard practice for virtually every guard to push forward hypothetical ideas or potential scenarios about how a robbery could take place. It was just a fun way for them to pass the time on what was ordinarily a very boring job, and should not be taken as an indicator that whoever was talking about it was actually planning on doing it. All that being said, I think there's a good chance that whoever committed this crime was a former guard, or at the very least, a guard was in on the robbery in some fashion. It sounds like the United Bank Tower was not exactly the best place for guards to work, as the pay was low, the conditions were subpar, and there were always constant complaints about the inadequate security measures. As a result, turnover there was quite high, so it's not hard to imagine some disgruntled former employee taking advantage of their knowledge of the facility and the holes in the security in order to orchestrate a heist. Hell, if they had a particularly miserable time working there and were filled with anger about it, that could provide some insight into why they elected to murder the guards on duty. The fact that all of the videotapes, the master keys, and pages from the logbook were stolen is a sign that the perpetrator had inside knowledge of the facility, because I'm not sure an outsider who had never been there before would have the wherewithal to do all this. Now, one of the biggest unanswered questions in this case is the alarm which went off inside the tunnel at the bank at 5:04 a.m., 4 hours before the robbery took place. Since the logbook was stolen, we're not sure what action, if any, was taken by the guards who were on duty at the time, but the alarm was not actually reset until 9:33, which is after all 4 of the guards there were killed. According to electronic records, McCullom's access card was used to enter the guard room at 9:24, and then used to enter the vault area at 9:48, but it shouldn't have taken the robber around 20 minutes to walk there, indicating that he may have taken a special trip to deactivate the alarm at 9:33. But how would he even know that he needed to do that? This is why there's always been speculation that more than one person was involved in the robbery, and that a second individual may have already been present in the building before the gunman even entered. All 6 of the surviving employees only reported seeing one robber, so if a second person was involved, it doesn't appear that they entered the vault area at any point. I'm going to have to be a bit delicate discussing this next part because I don't want to potentially accuse a murder victim of doing something they didn't do, but what about the possibility that one of the murdered guards could have been in on the heist before they were double-crossed and killed by the gunman? At King's trial, the defense kept bringing up the 5:04 a.m. alarm as a means to generate reasonable doubt, but they shied away from directly accusing any of the guards of being complicit because that probably would have rubbed the jury the wrong way. But theoretically, if the robber was not actually a former guard and only got access to the facility through the assistance of one of the guards, that could explain why this person has never popped up on the radar as a suspect. Out of the 4 murdered guards, I think we can rule out Scott McCarthy and Todd Wilson as being involved, as this was McCarthy's first day on the job, and Wilson had only worked there 6 days. In fact, Wilson was legally blind to one eye and training to be a counselor, and only decided to take on this job as a guard because he thought the work might enhance his resume. But William McCullom and Phillip Mankoff had been employed there long enough to develop knowledge of the layout and the security protocols, and neither of them were in a great financial place at that time. Before he was hired by United Bank, Mankoff had previously filed for bankruptcy, and McCullom was working 2 jobs in order to pay off over $15,000 in delinquent student loans. Prior to the robbery, McCullom had worked overnight, and his shift technically should have ended at 7 a.m., but he volunteered to stay longer in order to help train McCarthy. While the primary theory is that the robber accessed the facility by pretending to be Vice President Robert Bardwell, there are technically no living witnesses who can 100% confirm this is what happened. Mankoff had apparently written something in the logbook about McCullom letting someone named Bardwell into the building, but if McCullom was complicit in the robbery, this could have been a cover story, and Mankoff simply wrote down what McCullom told him. And when McCullom let the robber into the facility, this guy double-crossed and fatally shot him once he made it inside. Or alternatively, if you believe Mankoff was an inside man, the perpetrator could have double-crossed him by shooting him in the guardroom, and McCarthy and Wilson were killed because they happened to be witnesses. You might be wondering why an inside man would wait until after 9 a.m. to let the gunman into the facility, since there would be 2 additional guards on duty, but performing a robbery in the middle of the night would not make much sense, since the morning cash deposits had not yet arrived in the vault. Again, I do not want to accuse McCullom, Mankoff, or any of the other murdered victims of being complicit in this robbery, because as far as I can tell, no one had a bad word to say about any of them, and the authorities had never given off any indication that they might be involved. But the idea of an outsider being provided with information about the facility from an employee could go a long way towards explaining why he has never been identified. So we've had 2 other people who have been pushed forward as possible alternate suspects to James King, one of them a career bank robber and the other a former guard. The bank robber was Dewey Calvin Baker, who sent numerous letters to the defense team during King's trial, in which he confessed to the robbery and murders, but the judge did not find his confessions to be credible, and Baker eventually recanted. We know that Baker was paroled from prison on May 2, 1991, and arrested again by the end of the year, and while he resided in California, phone records showed that he did pay a visit to Denver in the weeks prior to the robbery. And while there's nothing to conclusively place him in Denver on the actual date of the crime, it certainly wouldn't have been impossible for Baker to travel there from California and then immediately head back home before anyone noticed. An important lead in this case, which seemed to get pushed aside after King was arrested, was the suspicious-looking man with a satchel who was seen at Stapleton International Airport a couple hours after the robbery and wanted to pay cash to rent a car without providing a credit card. He did seem to match the description of the robber, and while he was never positively identified, the employees who dealt with him did confirm that he was not James King. He definitely fit the profile of a man who may have recently acquired a lot of money and was desperate to get out of town without leaving a paper trail, which would make sense if it was Dewey Calvin Baker and he had traveled there from California. But the issue is that Baker was released from prison only 6 weeks before the United Bank robbery took place and had been behind bars for years prior to that, so would he really have been able to acquire the necessary knowledge to rob such a large facility? Yes, he did pay a trip to Denver, but we don't know if he ever visited the United Bank Tower, so unless he knew someone on the inside and was being fed information by them, would he have been able to pull this off? Since King's trial was broadcast live on Court TV, it would not surprise me if Baker might have been following the trial from jail and decided that he wanted to toy with the authorities by inserting himself into the case. But while I have my doubts that Baker was the perpetrator, guard Paul Yoakum is a very interesting alternate suspect. I mentioned earlier that James King was described as a mild-mannered, down-to-earth guy, but Paul Yoakum seemed like a pretty embittered person who was holding a lot of anger towards his former employer. Much like King, Yoakum went on trial for a completely different robbery at the United Bank Tower, this time from the ATM room, and was found not guilty. Some people think it was too much of a coincidence that the ATM robbery took place on Memorial Day weekend, while the United Bank massacre took place on Father's Day, because on those particular weekends, the cash receipts which got deposited at the bank would have been larger than usual. Without knowing many more details about the ATM case, I can't really come to a solid conclusion about whether Yoakum actually committed that crime, as it sounds like the only evidence against him was a partial confession which was later recanted, as well as the fact that Yoakum was the last guard known to have frequented the ATM room before the robbery took place, and some witnesses saw a guy matching his description who appeared to be fleeing the scene afterwards. But much like this case, none of the missing money was ever recovered, and since there was such little evidence, Yoakum seemed to take great offense to the fact that United Bank had accused him of this crime, which is why he decided to resign following his trial. Though, all things considered, it was remarkably considerate of them to even keep Yoakum on the payroll while he was facing such serious charges. Yoakum was very angry about the fact that he was forced to go into debt and borrow money from his father in order to pay for his legal defense, so if he was wrongfully accused of the ATM robbery, I can see a scenario unfolding where Yoakum decided to orchestrate a robbery for real in order to get back at his former employer. However, even though he had a large cache of guns and ammo in his apartment, there was no evidence linking Yoakum to the United Bank robbery, and none of the witnesses were able to pick him out of a photo lineup. But it is interesting how Yoakum personally told the authorities that he felt James King might be a compelling suspect in the crime, which could have been a strategy to divert suspicion away from himself if he was guilty. Yoakum was called upon to testify as a witness at King's trial, but he had put on an additional 50 pounds by that point, and his health was deteriorating as he succumbed to a fatal heart attack only 4 months after the trial ended. You could interpret this as Yoakum being overwhelmed by the stress of the situation, as perhaps he was paranoid that the authorities would come after him again following King's acquittal. But much like with King, the authorities did not find a hidden stash of money anywhere after Yoakum passed away, and there was nothing to indicate that he suddenly came into a lot of cash and started spending it after the robbery took place. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases where a suspect is taken to trial and found not guilty, the investigation essentially grounds to a halt because the authorities remain convinced that they got the right guy all along, so they feel there's nothing else they can do because of double jeopardy. That seems to be the case here, as the general consensus from law enforcement seemed to be that King was the perpetrator, and when the most promising alternate suspect, Paul Yoakum, passes away a few months after the trial, where do they go from there? In the past several years, we've seen numerous cases of suspects being posthumously linked to unsolved crimes via DNA testing or genetic genealogy, but I'm not sure if that approach would work here because the murders involved the victims being shot, so I don't know if the perpetrator left any DNA behind. And if he did, who knows if the authorities even collected it, as DNA testing in criminal cases was still in its infancy back in 1991. One potentially compelling piece of evidence were the cigarette butts found in the tunnel where the 5:04 a.m. alarm went off, as they could have belonged to someone who was involved in the robbery. If these cigarette butts were tested for DNA, they could provide some further insight into what happened, but the butts have since gone missing. After reviewing all the evidence, my personal opinion is that I really don't think James King was the right guy, because while there are a few things which make him look suspicious, there is a lot of compelling evidence pointing away from him as well. Either way, I definitely cannot disagree with the not guilty verdict, since his guilt was not proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But I'm also not entirely convinced Paul Yoakum did it either, and would not be surprised if the real perpetrator was never even investigated by law enforcement. I do think there's a good chance that the mysterious man with the satchel seen trying to rent a car from the airport on the day of the crime might be the robber, but if he was not from the Denver area and skipped town and started spending the money elsewhere without ever returning, then he would have had an easier time getting away with it. However, I do think that the person who did this had to have some inside knowledge of the United Bank Tower in order to pull it off, so if this individual was not a former guard or employee, they may have had an inside man who was supplying them with information. If this was just your standard bank robbery involving stolen money, then I'm not sure if people would still be talking about it after all these years, but the big tragedy here is that 4 men senselessly lost their lives and never received justice, and through all the drama surrounding this case, we should definitely remember their names: William McCullom Jr., Phillip Mankoff, Scott McCarthy, and Todd Wilson. So if you happen to have any information about the Father's Day Bank Massacre, please contact the appropriate authorities. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released over 70 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I actually took a break from my usual true crime content and released another movie-themed episode, this time counting down my top 10 favorite movie villains. In addition, I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my 2 co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover a case from Australia about a missing boat, the 1988 disappearance of the Patinella. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 60 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listener who has signed up with us on Patreon this week, Danielle G. Thank you so much for your support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I'd like to play a promo for another true crime podcast. 1 minute and 43 seconds.
At 1:19 a.m. on the morning of March 8, 2014, Zahari Ahmed Shah, captain of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, uttered the last words that would ever come from the plane. 1 minute and 43 seconds later, the flight would make a dramatic turn off course, the first move in a series of events that would set one of the greatest mysteries of all time in motion. My name is Megan, and I want to introduce you to 1 minute 43 seconds, a true unsolved mysteries podcast inspired by MH370 and all the other unsolved mysteries of the world. Hosted by me, in each episode, I'll take you through a different, compelling, real unsolved case that will leave you scratching your head. Like the story of a mother and daughter that disappeared from the same city 17 years apart. Or the case of a young girl who was smuggled into the United States illegally, only to vanish 3 months later. There's the disappearance of an entire family from a rural town in Canada. A mysterious news broadcast with an unknown origin. And many, many more. The world is full of mysteries, and if you're intrigued by the strange and the bizarre, please consider joining us as we dive into the unknown. 1 minute and 43 seconds, available now where you get your podcasts and on YouTube.
In addition, I'm excited to announce that this coming fall, I will be attending yet another podcasting event, the Berkshire Podcast Festival, which is taking place in North Adams, Massachusetts from October the 18th until the 20th. It's being organized by Josh Hallmark of the True Crime Bullshit podcast and will feature a number of high-profile shows, including yours truly. If you would like to purchase tickets, please visit their website, berkshirepodcastfestival.com, and use our specialized promo code COLD2024 to get a 35% discount on tickets. Once again, that's berkshirepodcastfestival.com, and use the promo code COLD2024 to get a 35% discount on tickets. Hope to see you there. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter or Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Anyway, I hope to see some of you in Denver this weekend at the True Crime Podcast Festival, but if not, have yourselves a great week, and join us again next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.